So I hope to do two things this morning. One is to give a bit of an intro to Advent for those of you who might find yourself new to it. And the second is to launch us into this week's Advent theme. And I want to start by making a bit of a declaration. We have a weight problem. I got this phrase from a couple pastors who were talking about the opportunity of Advent. We are losing any ability to wait, like for anything. And yet, like at the heart, the center of the Christian life is a profound invitation to watch and to wait for God to act. If you're hearing the word Advent for the first time, the word literally just means coming, which makes Advent the season of the church year where we focus all of our attention on what it means for God to come to us. Right? And so before Advent is anything, it is a reminder of God's grace. Right? Here is what Advent declares. We have not been forgotten. We have not been abandoned. Our cries have been heard. We don't have to somehow find our way to God. Because God has come to us. We have been found. In flesh and blood, God has come. And since Advent is the season that leads up to Christmas, right? The Advent is followed by Christmas. It's really easy for Advent and Christmas to sort of blend together so that Advent is this like long celebration of the time, of the moment when God came. Right? Advent can easily focus mostly on the moment when God came. Remarkably, right? In full vulnerability of human flesh, in a body that was marked for death purely because it was human, in the person of Jesus. Right? We can remember those who waited for the Messiah to come for hundreds of years, and then we can celebrate with them that their wait is over. But when we do this, Advent gets turned into an extended pre-Christmas season, like a time to celebrate. But there have been some who have watched the church for a period of time, who have made a compelling case that an Advent focused entirely on the birth of Jesus, with the familiar themes of hope and peace and joy and love, have made Christians a bit weak and maybe imbalanced. We have a weight problem. Imagine with me for a second someone who goes to the gym and only ever exercises their arms. Right? Can you picture the person with an inflated upper body and, nothing for legs? Or imagine someone spending all kinds of time working out, but they never strengthen their core. And so they're getting injured all the time. Or what about the person who wants to get strong, who pays for some fancy device or pays for a pill or some quick fix, empty promise that says, I can make you strong. But the device, the promise is a lie, and so it ends up doing nothing. Right? We probably don't have to work very hard to imagine any of these situations because these are actually just part of our lives. Where Advent focuses only on the birth of Jesus, we probably have some imbalances because God has not only come, but has promised to come again. and where Advent disappears entirely, and mostly what we have is just a cultural Christmas, our faith is probably a bit weak and undernourished. And I've been wondering, as I've been praying about this season and this moment, as I've been reading the journals and the letters that Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote to friends while he was in jail, in prison, during the season of Advent, a Christian arrested in Nazi Germany. As he wrote and reflected on the season, I've been wondering what would happen if we treated Advent like a regular season of strength training, right? The way that professional athletes will dedicate part of their preseason to building strength before they show up at training camp so they're like ready. What would it look like for us to enter into Advent dedicated and devoted, ready to get strong in whatever way that God might strengthen us? Ready to work our spiritual muscles, ready to live a sort of muscular faith. And that begs the question, well, like, what are the muscles that need the most attention? And I might say, our waiting muscles. Our waiting muscles. And so here's a quick assessment. There are probably bonus questions you could come up with, but this was the quick list I have, right? Do you have any ability to wait in a line without pulling out a cell phone or device of some sort to distract you? Or do you have any ability to wait for anything that is about to start without looking somewhere else? When you pull up to a red light, do you move into the shorter lane? Do you switch lines at the register if it looks like the other lane is moving faster? Do you skip standing in lines and pre-order and go to the mobile order? How much money are you willing to spend to skip the lines at an amusement park? What do you do when life feels chaotic and out of control? Are you quick to turn to God? Or are you quicker to launch in and start getting everything in order? There are probably other questions you could ask that would help diagnose us as people who have a problem with waiting. It's been said that an inability to wait well, to wait on God, is probably pretty close to being at the heart of sin. If you were to think of a couple stories that open our entire Bible, Adam and Eve, they just will not wait for God to give them his wisdom in the garden in his timing. Instead, they grasp for the fruit in their impatience. Abram and Sarai do not wait for God to fulfill his promise of a son. Instead, they began to manufacture a plan for how to make a baby on their own. Jacob and Rebekah, they do not wait for God to fulfill his promise of a blessing. Instead, they trick Isaac and they trick Esau into giving it up, and they take this blessing that God has promised and offered. And we could walk through the whole Bible this way, identifying the same pattern, right? People sin against God and they sin against each other because they cannot wait for God to act. And so they take matters into their own hands, and everywhere that humans go, right? Humans have this habit of just creating death. Romans describes it as sort of earning death for themselves, for each other, for creation. Death is everywhere as a result of our impatience and our inability to wait. We have a wait problem. But there are an ancient set of exercises available to us that have often been forgotten, neglected, that could make us stronger, that could help us strengthen our waiting muscles. But these exercises aren't super comfortable. They don't really provide us with any quick fixes, but they do have a track record. And these exercises are rooted in this. Instead of focusing only on the time when God came, going further back, the church has historically used these 4 Sundays in Advent to look forward. To look forward to the day when God will come again in glory. And in place of the Advent themes that are so familiar to us, hope and peace and joy and love, which are still essential parts of our life with Christ, there is an older set of themes that have helped the church to anticipate and prepare for what God has planned. Advent, the beginning of the church year, is the time set aside for the church to look forward. What is God up to? Do you know how to answer that question? Like, what has God promised to do? What are the things that we are looking forward to? What is the end of this story that we are busy living together? Think about what we do when we look forward. Like, we do this at the beginning of every year, or some people do to different degrees, but like, we often look forward by setting New Year's resolutions of some kind that help us become the kind of people we want to be in the future. Advent, the beginning of the year, is where we look at God's promises, right? Promises to make all things new. Promises to wipe away every tear, to heal all of creation. And we realize there are no resolutions we can make to get God to fulfill his promises. Right? There are no habits that we could start that would help us make all things new. There's no goal that we could set that would wipe away every tear from every eye. Because this is God's work. This is his promise. And Advent invites us to pay attention to what God is up to watch him do it, and wait for him to get it done. The themes that have historically helped God's people focus on God's future in order that we might become people who can wait well are death, judgment, heaven, and hell. And so that's where we're going to spend our next 4 weeks. Who's pumped for Advent? I want to offer a slight pastoral warning. If you listen to me talk about death for the next few minutes here in worship and you leave, and you don't keep talking about death, maybe at lunch, it'll be a fun lunch conversation with your neighborhood group, with your family, with each other. It will be like going to the gym once a week. And while you're at the gym watching a video about the kind of workout you should do, but you never actually end up doing the workout because you just watched the video, and so then you leave and then you come back next week just to watch the next video of the thing that you should do. There's a reflection on death. There's an engagement with death and with these themes that is required of us if we are going to learn how to wait. And this morning, I'm inviting you into a week-long meditation on death. So, weird transition, but I want to talk about comedy for a second. There's a comedian that I really enjoy. He's really nerdy, a former engineers, who uses PowerPoint in his stand-up comedy to make math and statistics fun and funny. I think he does a pretty good job of it. He makes a lot of jokes about how bad we are at interpreting statistics. For instance, he points out, you might know this statistic, that about 45% of marriages end in divorce. And he points out that we think that's not as bad as it could be. Like, it's not too bad actually. In fact, the majority of marriages don't end in divorce. And that seems like good news. But the other 55% of marriages, the majority of marriages, still end. 55% of marriages end in death. That's a different way of looking at that statistic. 45% of marriages end in divorce. Like, okay. It could be worse, it could be bad. 55% of marriages end in death. And we don't really like to think about that very much. More and more, since the very first wedding I did, I find couples asking me to take "till death do us part" out of the wedding vows. As if not saying marriage will end in death will like somehow prevent it. In the 1970s, Ernest Becker wrote a book describing Americans and our the book was called Denial of Death. Becker actually argues that Americans are especially bad at death, but fears of death are a central part of the human experience. Because other scholars have found the evidence of people, humans, that have been dealing with anxiety around death going back as long as humans have been recording their thoughts and their feelings. And one psychologist wrote this, it's up on the screen. We are the only species that we know of that has the cognitive capacity to contemplate and anticipate our own death. Yet this impressive ability comes with a downside. We are destined to live our lives forever shadowed by the knowledge that we will grow, blossom, and inevitably diminish and die. Like, how about this ride, right? I don't know how many of you are like, we're kind of soaring in here this morning on the highs of Thanksgiving, all the good feels, having a good time. Here we face the inevitability of death. Listen again to this description of our lives. We are destined to live our lives forever shadowed by the knowledge that we will grow, blossom, and inevitably diminish and die. The psychologist is saying nothing that our faith hasn't already taught us. Just as sin came into the world through one man and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sinned. That's where our passage started that David and Carson read for us in Romans chapter 5:12. But I like this psychologist's phrase, forever shadowed by the knowledge of our death. We live in a shadow. We live in the dark. In a real way. I'm not sure how this sits with you, right? Because sometimes we can talk about the birth of Jesus as like the moment when darkness was gone and light has replaced it forever, right? And I'm like, let's not fool ourselves. Like, the darkness is not gone. In fact, the darkness doesn't even seem to be receding. People talk about the 20th century as the bloodiest century in history. The light has come to shine in the darkness. And the darkness will not overcome the light, the Gospel of John tells us. But as preacher Fleming Rutledge loves to say, Advent begins in the dark. What that means is that we declare God has come. Jesus lived and died. Jesus was raised from the dead, declaring victory over death, even mocking it, right? In fact, we continue to mock death every Sunday. We gather and we say it was on this day when Jesus defeated death, overcame death. We celebrate God's power over death every single week. We mock death by coming here and worshiping God in the face of death. And yet, everywhere we look, people are still dying. I mean, we took some time this morning to remember some of those people that we have loved and lost. And maybe it's been a bit for you since death was close. But just this week, a 40-year-old man died here in Livermore when he crashed his motorcycle into a telephone pole. And I think it was last week, it might have been 2 weeks ago, the owner of a local restaurant in Pleasanton died down on vacation in Mexico at an event that he was attending. And Russ and Claudia have some close friends whose 17-year-old niece just died in a car accident a month or so ago. And in the last couple months, I have 2 different friends who lost stillborn babies. One is a Nazarene pastor whose church meets in our building on Sunday nights, Pastor Miguel. Right, like the list goes on. We are in the dark as we continue to make our way through what the psalmist calls the valley of the shadow of death. Psalm 23 names this valley. The psalmist says what I think we all wish we could say. I know I do. I will fear no evil. Death, the last enemy to be destroyed, is death. And we acknowledge death is not God's design. Death was not his plan A. Death undoes what God established and called good. God creates life. Death ends it. And according to the Bible, death is God's final enemy. It is bad. It is evil. And yet the psalmist says, I will fear no evil. Right? I will not fear death, even though I am surrounded by it. I will not fear death, even though it has promised to claim me at some point, just as it has everyone else. I so badly want to say this. I want this to be true for me. But death anxiety is real, and it is pervasive. Not only that, but it's grown in recent years. A study published by Cambridge University shows this huge surge in death anxiety because of the pandemic over the last several years. And so here's what I'm not going to do this morning. I'm not going to stand here and tell you to not fear. Because how lame, and I know some of you won't like this word, but it is. It's stupid. It would be stupid of me to tell you to just stop doing the thing that most humans throughout history have done, right? The thing that it comes natural to us. It is like in our flesh. It's the water that we're swimming in, to be afraid of this thing that we don't understand, that is mysterious, that we can't see into. For me to say just hey, don't be afraid, guys, would be like me saying hey, go ahead and stop breathing for a while. But instead, what I want to do to finish is I just want to give us three things that might help us overcome our weight problem as we face death. I want to give you a promise, I want to give you a practice, and I want to give you a preview. Some good alliteration right there. A promise, a practice, and a preview. First, the promise. If you hear anything from this morning, I pray that you hear this. Jesus promises that no matter how dark it gets, he will not leave us nor forsake us. He promised to be with us until the end of the age. It means until he returns and makes all things new and heals all creation, he will be with us. Psalm 23, the psalmist walks through the valley of the shadow of death, and he says, I will fear no evil because, what does he say? You are with me. He knows that God is with him. And so we have received a promise. God has given us his very own Spirit to confirm that promise. And remembering that promise, being present to his presence is part of how we wait. Well, it's part of how we approach death without fear, because we know that he already went through it for us. And this isn't easy, but oh, how good it is to be in his presence. And so I pray this morning that you would remember his promise and hear in his promise an invitation that he has already come near to you. And so, would you come near to him? Second, the practice. We can stop distracting ourselves from the wait. So when we get in line and we pull out our phones, it's a way of minimizing the wait, right? Well, when we look to the end of our lives and we see the death that we all face, it's easy to deny it. We can do all sorts of things to push death off, to delay it, as though that will somehow help us avoid it forever. Sometimes while we wait, we can pretend it's not real and say, oh, well, let's just look at all the happy stuff rather than the sad stuff. But what if our time in line is what prepares us for the moment when we arrive? And this takes practice. So I said the second one is a practice. Historically, Christians have gone to a lot of funerals and have actually spent a decent amount of time in cemeteries because we refuse to avoid reality. One of the things that Christians have historically done is read the journals and letters of those who have died, of those who faced their death with the kind of courage we want. It's one of the reasons I've been reading Bonhoeffer's letters and journals, trying to practice what I'm preaching. We need to talk about death. We need to plan our own. There's an incredible power in families. I've seen this again and again when a family can talk about and plan for the death of somebody. Something incredible happens where God is at work. And we just need to find ways to anticipate death and be less surprised that it continues to be part of our lives and our world. That's the practice. And then finally, the preview. The passage of scripture that David and Carson read for us, you could spend a lifetime meditating on those verses. I dare you to go home and just reread this morning's passage from Romans. This passage that declares that Jesus dies. Jesus died. And if you were baptized, you have already died as well. You want to enter into a mystery for a bit. If you've been baptized, you're already dead. I saw a couple young faces look at me like, what? Yeah. Romans invites us to preview our deaths, to taste death. As we begin to die to the lies that this life often makes, to the empty promises, the cheap thrills of this life, we begin to taste real life. And those who have learned to die, not just once in their baptism, but daily, will talk about what it looks like to taste life, real life. And they will talk about a fear of death that shrinks. Because they began to see that what we see and experience and take as the norm is not all there is. And that eternal life, the life that God has for us, is so much more. And it begins now. One of the ways that we preview death is first in our baptism. But we also preview death as we come to the table together. Paul tells us that every time we eat the bread and we drink the cup, we proclaim the Lord's death until he returns. This table sets our vision to the future, when death will be undone. But we gather around a table when we remember that Jesus died for us. And so, the invitation is not to not fear death. The invitation is to find our lives in the one who overcame it.